Helena Whitaker walked into that courtroom like she already owned the verdict. She set her lawyer's files on the table, looked straight at Evelyn, and said it loud enough for every person in that room to hear. "You're a stranger. Nobody here needs you, and nobody here wants you." Rose, 8 years old, sitting on that hard wooden bench, tightened her grip on Evelyn's hand until her knuckles went white. Evelyn didn't step back. She didn't look away. She had crossed half a continent alone with $42 and a carpet bag. She had fixed fence lines in the frozen ground and fought wolves in the dark and stood in front of a town that had already decided what she was. She had not come this far to be dismissed by a woman with a good coat and a Cheyenne lawyer. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you've already decided is home, this story is for you. Hit like if you want Evelyn to win. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The morning Evelyn Hartwell left Cincinnati, nobody came to see her off. That was the part she never told anyone afterward. Not the cold, not the fear, not the weight of the single carpet bag she carried down the depot platform. What stayed with her, what clung to the inside of her chest like frost on a window pane, was the stillness of the platform behind her. She had expected at least her cousin Margaret to appear. Margaret had promised, in that careless way she had of promising things, that she would be there. But the platform was empty except for a porter wheeling a cart of luggage and a drunk man sleeping against a post. And Evelyn stood alone at the edge of the train car with her bag in her hand and nowhere to put her eyes. She was 31 years old. She had never been west of the Ohio River. She climbed the steps and found her seat and watched Cincinnati disappear through a smudged window, and she told herself the tightening in her throat was just the cold air from the gap in the doorframe. It wasn't grief, it wasn't doubt. It was just cold air. The letters from Nathan Blackwood were in her bag, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft. She had read them so often she could recite whole passages without looking, the careful formal sentences of a man who was not comfortable writing but had pushed through the discomfort anyway. He had described the ranch in Wyoming Territory. He had described his daughter Rose, who was 7 and stubborn and had stopped talking much after her mother died. He had described himself in the 3rd or 4th letter, reluctantly, as a man who was doing his best with a situation he had not expected to be in. He had never once said he was lonely, but loneliness was the thing that came through every line. Evelyn had answered his advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette because she was tired of teaching school and tired of living in her cousin's spare room and tired of feeling like she was watching her own life from a great distance, the way you watched a wagon roll past on a muddy street, present, in motion, and completely beyond your reach. She had answered 6 advertisements in total. 5 men had never written back. Nathan Blackwood had written back within 2 weeks, a single page that was careful and plain and somehow more honest than anything she had read in years. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself this was a sensible arrangement between 2 adults who understood the terms. She did not tell herself she was hoping for something. That would have been too embarrassing to admit, even privately. The train took 4 days. She changed lines twice and sat in depot waiting rooms that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, eating hard biscuits from a paper parcel and drinking coffee that tasted like boiled metal. By the time she reached Laramie, the last stop before the wagon would take her to the town nearest Blackwood Ranch, her back ached in a specific grinding way that had become familiar, and she had stopped being nervous somewhere around the Missouri border and started being something else. A flat, concentrated calm that felt almost like courage, but probably wasn't. The wagon driver who met her at Laramie was a man named Perkins who chewed tobacco and said almost nothing for the entire 2-hour ride, which suited Evelyn fine. She looked out at the land, and the land looked back at her, and it was bigger than she had prepared herself for. Not bigger in a beautiful way, though it was that too, but bigger in the way of something that didn't care about you at all. The sky went on in every direction without apology. The grass went on below it. The wind came straight across with nothing to slow it down. She thought, if this doesn't work, I have no way home. She had $42 in the bottom of her carpet bag. That was everything she owned that wasn't fabric or paper. When the wagon turned up the long track toward Blackwood Ranch, Evelyn straightened her back and pressed her hands flat against her skirt and breathed through her nose. The ranch came into view slowly, a large barn first, then a corral, then the house, which was bigger than she'd expected and more weathered than she'd imagined. The wood of the fence posts had gone gray. The yard was packed dirt with a few scraggly weeds pushing up near the gate, the kind of weeds that grow not because the conditions are good, but because nothing is alive enough to compete with them. A man was standing near the corral. She knew immediately it was Nathan Blackwood, not because he matched any description she'd formed in her mind, but because he was the only person there, and he was standing the way a man stands when he is waiting for something he's not sure he wants to arrive. Arms crossed, shoulders set. His hat was pulled low enough that she couldn't read his face clearly from the wagon seat, but she could feel the stillness of him from 30 yards away. Perkins pulled the horses up near the gate. Evelyn climbed down before he could offer to help her, because she had learned in 4 days of travel that accepting help with every small thing made you feel smaller with each acceptance. She picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the gate, and Nathan Blackwood watched her come without moving. She was 10 feet from him when the movement came from her left, fast, like a startled animal, and a small figure crashed into her so hard Evelyn had to take a step back to keep her balance. The girl had both arms locked around Evelyn's waist and her face pressed into Evelyn's coat, and she was shaking, not crying, just shaking. And Evelyn stood there with one arm raised and her carpet bag swinging and no idea what to do with her hands. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," the child said. Her voice was muffled against the wool. "I was afraid you'd decide not to." Evelyn looked up at Nathan. His face had changed. The guarded stillness was still there, but something underneath it had cracked just slightly, the way ice cracks before it gives. Not broken, just compromised. "Rose." His voice was even, controlled. "Give her room." Rose did not give her room. She tightened her grip. Evelyn slowly put her free arm around the girl's shoulders and held her, awkwardly, because she had not held a child in years and had forgotten the specific weight of it. "It's all right," she said, to the girl, to the man, to no one in particular. "I'm here." Nathan looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Then he nodded, once, and turned toward the house. "I'll get your bag." "I have it?" He stopped, turned back. There was something in his face she couldn't quite name. Not irritation, not surprise, but something between them that wasn't comfortable yet. "All right," he said. She followed him inside. The house was clean in the way that houses are clean when someone has worked hard at it without particular feeling. Surfaces wiped, floors swept, nothing left out that didn't need to be. But there were no curtains on 2 of the windows. There was no cloth on the table. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph above the fireplace that Evelyn deliberately didn't look at on that first pass through the room, though she was aware of it the entire time, the way you're aware of something bright in your peripheral vision. Nathan showed her the room that was to be hers. It had a bed and a chest of drawers and a window that faced east, and it smelled faintly of cedar and dust. "It's fine," she said. "The water for washing is in the pitcher. I refill it mornings." "Thank you." He stood in the doorway for a moment with the particular awkwardness of a man who has said all the practical things and has nothing left that comes easily. "Dinner's at 6. I usually do it myself." A pause. "Rose helps sometimes." "I can cook," Evelyn said, "if that would be useful." He looked at her with an expression she would spend weeks learning to read. "We'll see how it goes," he said. She didn't take that as encouragement because it wasn't, but she took it as honest, and honest was something she could work with. The first week at Blackwood Ranch established the shape of things in ways that Evelyn hadn't fully anticipated from the letters. Nathan was not cruel. She had braced herself for that possibility without quite admitting it, the way you brace for a bad step on a staircase you haven't walked before. He was not cruel, and he was not cold in the way that came from meanness. He was cold in the way that came from having learned, in some specific and terrible event, that warmth had a cost he wasn't willing to pay again. He did what needed doing. He spoke when something needed to be said. He thanked her when she cooked, and when she helped with the mending, and when she sat with Rose in the evenings to help with the letters Rose was learning to write. But he did not linger. He did not ask questions that weren't necessary. He went to bed early and rose before light and worked with the focused desperation of a man who used labor to keep something at bay. She didn't know yet what he was keeping at bay. She had guesses. Rose was easier and harder at the same time. Easier because the child was openly glad she was there. Not politely glad, not performing gladness, but genuinely, almost desperately glad, which was its own kind of pressure. Rose followed Evelyn through the house and sat close at meals and appeared at the kitchen doorway when Evelyn was washing up, not saying anything, just present. Rose had a watchfulness that was unusual in a child, an attention to the exits, a habit of going very still when voices rose even slightly. On the fourth day, Rose told Evelyn, in the matter-of-fact way children sometimes deliver enormous information, "My mother died in the winter. Papa doesn't talk about it." "I know," Evelyn said carefully. "He mentioned it in his letters." Rose picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "He thinks it was his fault." She said it simply, without drama, the way you say something you've known for so long it no longer has an edge. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" Rose looked up at her. "I think the snow came and there was nothing to be done about the snow." She went back to her thread. "But Papa thinks different." It was the most they had spoken about it. Nathan didn't raise the subject. Evelyn didn't raise it either. But after that conversation, she understood the architecture of the house differently. The bare walls, the absence of softness, the way Nathan kept himself always in motion. He was not punishing himself for his wife's death in any dramatic way. He was just refusing to rest. Because rest was when you felt things. At the end of the first week, a rider came to the ranch. Evelyn was in the yard helping Rose hang washing when she heard hoofbeats on the track, and she looked up and saw a woman on a bay horse coming at a pace that suggested purpose rather than courtesy. The woman was well dressed for the territory. Not fancy, but deliberate. Her coat was good quality, and her posture was the posture of someone accustomed to being looked at. She reined up near the gate and looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not hostile and was not friendly and was somehow worse than either. "You must be the woman from Cincinnati," she said. "Evelyn Hartwell," Evelyn said. She did not add anything else. "Helena Whittaker." She said the name the way people say names they expect to be recognized. "Clara's sister." Evelyn knew the name. She knew the relationship. She had not expected to meet Helena in the first week, and she had not expected her to ride up to the gate and look down from horseback with that particular measuring expression, not cruel yet, just calculating, the way you look at something you're considering how to move. "Nathan's inside," Evelyn said. "I know where Nathan is." Helena looked past her at Rose, who had gone still beside Evelyn and was watching with those watchful eyes. "Hello, Rose." "Hello, Aunt Helena." Rose's voice was careful. Evelyn noticed she did not move toward her aunt. Helena's gaze came back to Evelyn. "I thought I'd come introduce myself," she said, "since you'll be living here." "That's kind of you." "I make it a point to know what's happening with my niece." A pause that was longer than it needed to be. "Clara asked me to watch over her before she died. I take that seriously." "I'm sure you do," Evelyn said. Helena looked at her for another moment, then swung down from the horse in a practiced motion and tied it to the gatepost. "I'll go see Nathan," she said, and walked past Evelyn toward the house without waiting to be invited in. Rose edged closer to Evelyn's side. Not dramatically, just close. Evelyn watched Helena's back and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, "This is not a social call." She was right. Inside, voices rose, not shouting, but elevated. The tone of a conversation that had been rehearsed on both sides. Evelyn stayed in the yard with Rose and continued hanging washing, piece by piece, and listened to the muffled cadence of it through the wall. She couldn't make out words. She didn't need to. The shape of the argument was familiar already from Nathan's letters, where Helena had appeared as a presence at the edge of things. Someone who sent letters about Rose's schooling, who had opinions about the ranch's management, who believed, with the certainty of grief, that she was the rightful guardian of her dead sister's daughter. Rose handed Evelyn a shirt to hang, and their hands almost touched around the fabric. "She wants to take me to live with her," Rose said, without inflection. "I know." "I don't want to go." Evelyn pinned the shirt to the line. "Then we'll make sure that doesn't happen." Rose looked at her with those old eyes in a young face. "Can you do that? You just got here." "I just got here," Evelyn agreed, "but I'm staying." 20 minutes later, Helena came out of the house with her jaw set and her coat buttoned up to the chin like armor. She untied her horse and mounted without looking at Evelyn, and then, at the last moment, turned in the saddle. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "I mean no offense to you personally, but Rose has family who loves her and who knew her mother. Whatever arrangement Nathan has made here," the pause was precise, pointed, "it doesn't change that." Evelyn held her gaze. "I don't doubt that you love her." Something shifted in Helena's expression. Surprise, maybe, that Evelyn hadn't bristled. "Then you understand my position." "I understand it," Evelyn said. "I just don't agree with it." Helena held her eyes for a moment longer, then turned her horse and rode back down the track without another word. Nathan appeared in the doorway. His jaw was tight. "I should have warned you about Helena." "You mentioned her in the letters." "Not enough, apparently." He looked down the track after her. "She's been threatening legal action since last month. She believes Rose would be better off with family." "What do you think?" He looked at her sharply, like the question caught him off guard. Then he looked away again. "I think Rose is my daughter, and this is her home, and nobody's taking her anywhere." The words came flat and certain as stones. "But Helena has money and connections and a lawyer in Cheyenne, and I've got a ranch that's already 3 months behind on bank payments." He said this last part the way you say a thing you've been carrying alone for a long time. Not as confession, not as plea, just as fact. Like he was tired of the weight of it being entirely private. "How far behind?" Evelyn asked. He looked at her again. Most women, she thought, would not have asked that. Most women would have offered comfort or changed the subject. She watched him decide what to do with her directness. $300, he said. By spring. $300 was nearly what the ranch earned in a good quarter. She understood immediately the shape of the problem. The bank would not wait indefinitely. Helena had resources and a legal argument that, depending on the judge, might carry real weight. And Nathan was here with a 7-year-old and a woman he'd known for 6 days and a ranch that was bleeding money it didn't have. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right? We'll figure it out." She paused. "Together." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she was still learning, that lived somewhere between suspicion and something that wasn't hope yet, but was adjacent to it. Then he nodded once and went back inside. Rose slipped her hand into Evelyn's. Evelyn held it and looked out at the land rolling away in every direction, enormous and indifferent, and thought, "I came here for a new beginning. I had no idea what I was walking into." But she didn't let go of the small hand in hers. She held on, because that was the only decision she was sure of. In this place she didn't know yet. In this life she hadn't fully chosen and couldn't quite picture and was not at all certain she could survive. She held on. That was where it started. The second week brought snow, early for the season, a thin coating that melted by noon but left the mornings brittle and gray. Evelyn learned the rhythms of the ranch the way you learn a new language. First the vocabulary, the individual tasks and their times and their tools, then slowly the grammar, the way one thing related to another, the logic underneath the routine. She learned that Nathan fed the horses before he fed himself. She learned that Rose ate slowly and carefully and always left a small portion on her plate that she never touched. Some childhood habit that probably had a story behind it Evelyn hadn't asked about yet. She learned that the ranch hands, 2 brothers named Cal and Tomas, who worked the cattle, treated her with a polite wariness that wasn't unfriendly, but was watching, the way men watch someone new enter a situation that already has its complications. She learned that Nathan never sat in the chair nearest the fireplace. It was a good chair, better padded than the others. No one sat in it. She didn't ask. What she did do in those first 2 weeks was make herself useful in ways that didn't require permission or discussion. She mended fence canvas when a stretch of it came loose in a wind. She reorganized the kitchen stores so Nathan could find what he needed without the 20-minute search that she'd watched him conduct twice for the same tin of coffee. She helped Rose with her letters every evening and discovered slowly that Rose was sharper than anyone seemed to have noticed. Not book sharp particularly, but perceptive sharp. The kind of intelligence that watches and connects things and draws conclusions other people haven't reached yet. "You're not like what I thought you'd be," Rose told her one evening, while Evelyn was braiding her hair for bed. "What did you think I'd be?" Rose considered. Nice but temporary, like the other women Papa tried. Evelyn's hand stilled in the braid. There were others? Two, before you. They both left pretty fast. A pause. Papa scared them off, I think. He gets very quiet when he's angry, and people think he's scary, but he's not really. He's just... She searched for the word. He's just far away. In his head. He goes somewhere you can't reach him. Evelyn thought about the chair by the fireplace that nobody sat in. She thought about the photograph above the mantel that she had now looked at, once, quickly, when she was alone in the room. A woman with light hair and a serious expression and Rose's exact eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Evelyn said. That's what the others said too. I know. She finished the braid and tied it off. But I mean it differently. She didn't know how to prove that yet. She just knew it was true. The trouble escalated on a Thursday morning when a man in a good coat arrived at the ranch with a document that he handed to Nathan with the particular blankness of someone delivering bad news for a living. Evelyn was close enough to see Nathan's face when he read it. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness, not controlled this time but arrested, like something had hit him and he hadn't reacted yet. He didn't show her the document until that evening. It was a legal petition filed in Laramie County Court. Helena Whitaker was formally petitioning for custody of Rose Blackwood on the grounds that the child's home environment was unstable, specifically citing the debt, the ranch's financial difficulties, and the recent introduction of a stranger from out of state with no ties to the community and no established relationship with the child. Evelyn read it twice. Then she set it on the table. When is the hearing? She asked. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She had been at Blackwood Ranch for 14 days. Do you have a lawyer? I have a man in town who draws up contracts. He's not a trial lawyer. Can we find one? Nathan looked at her across the table with something that might have been desperation, or might have been anger, or might have been, underneath both of those, a complicated relief that someone was asking practical questions instead of falling apart. With what money? She thought about the $42 in the bottom of her carpet bag, which was now $38 because she'd bought supplies on 2 trips into town. She thought about the $300 and the bank and the 6 weeks and Helena Whitaker on her bay horse with her carefully buttoned coat. We'll figure it out, she said again. This time Nathan didn't ask what she meant by that. He just sat there in the lamplight looking at the document on the table, and Evelyn could see the thing he was carrying, the full weight of it, in the set of his shoulders and the flatness around his eyes. She's not wrong that the ranch is struggling, he said. His voice was very even. She's not wrong that I made mistakes after Clara died. The debt happened because I was not... He stopped. I was not in a good place that winter. After. I borrowed money to keep things running, and I thought I'd pay it back by spring, and the spring was bad for cattle prices, and... He stopped again. The point is, a judge looking at the paper record is going to see a failing ranch and an out-of-state woman who arrived 2 weeks ago, and he's going to see what Helena wants him to see. Then we show him something different, Evelyn said. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple. I didn't say simple. I said we show him something different. She looked at him steadily across the table. I didn't come out here to lose, Nathan. He met her eyes for a moment that stretched. You've been here 2 weeks, he said. I know how long I've been here. He looked away, looked at the document, looked at the window where the night was pressing in from outside, enormous and cold. Then he said quietly, Why are you fighting this? You could leave. Helena would probably even pay your fare back east if you asked her to. You could go back to Cincinnati. The question wasn't cruel. It was honest, and honesty from him was rare enough that she recognized the weight of it. Because Rose is afraid, Evelyn said, and because you need someone on your side, and because... She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. Because I didn't cross the whole country to walk away from something just because it's hard. The lamp flame moved in a draft from the window. Nathan nodded very slowly. All right, he said. All right, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a beginning, exactly. It was more like 2 people standing at the edge of something difficult and deciding, separately and at the same time, to walk into it rather than away from it. Outside, the wind moved across the Wyoming territory without stopping for anything, the way wind does out there, the way everything does, through, not around. Evelyn listened to it and thought about the train platform in Cincinnati, the empty platform, and Margaret, who hadn't come. She thought, good. I don't need anyone behind me. I just need to know where I'm going. She wasn't sure of that either, not yet, but she was still there, at the table, in the lamplight, in the house that smelled of cedar and work and old grief. And that, she had decided, was enough for now. The legal petition sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before Nathan folded it and put it in the drawer with the land deed and the bank correspondence. And even after it was out of sight, it was still the first thing in the room, the thing every conversation moved around without touching, the way water moves around a stone in a creek bed. Evelyn had learned in those first 2 weeks not to push Nathan toward conversations he wasn't ready for. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she had begun to understand that pushing him produced a particular kind of stillness. Not the ordinary stillness of a man thinking, but a locked down, retreated stillness that could last for hours. You didn't get anything useful out of that stillness. You just waited it out, which wasted time neither of them had. So she didn't push. She worked instead. There was always work. The ranch produced it endlessly, the way bad weather produced mud. Not maliciously, just as a consequence of existing in that place in that season. She learned the stores and the supplies and the rhythm of what ran short and when. She learned which of the fence lines Cal and Tomas were watching and which Nathan had quietly stopped mentioning because the cost of repairing them was beyond what the accounts could carry. She learned the cattle numbers, how many head Nathan had started the year with, how many he'd sold to make the summer payment to the bank, how many remained and what they'd fetch at the fall market if prices held. They weren't going to hold. She could read that in Nathan's face when he came in from riding the herd, even when he said nothing about it. The morning of the 18th day, she was measuring flour when Cal knocked on the kitchen doorframe, hat in his hands. Cal was the older of the two brothers, early 30s, quiet, with the permanent squint of a man who spent most of his life looking into distance and wind. "Ma'am," he said, which was how he always started, regardless of what came after. "What is it, Cal?" "Wolves got into the south pasture last night." He turned the hat slowly in his hands. "Lost 2 calves, maybe a third. Tomas is still out checking the count." Evelyn set down the flour scoop. "Does Nathan know?" "Just told him. He's out there now." Cal paused. "Wanted you to know, too, since you've been tracking the numbers." She hadn't asked to be included in that way. She'd simply started keeping a tally in a notebook she'd bought in town. Feed costs, supply runs, what came in and what went out. And at some point, Nathan had stopped keeping his own separate count and started consulting hers. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. Neither, she suspected, was he. She went out to the south pasture. Nathan was standing at the edge of the tree line where the wolves had come through, reading the ground the way men who work land learn to read it. Tracks, disturbance, the particular story that the pressed grass and drag marks were telling. He didn't look up when she came to stand beside him. "Third calf is gone too," he said. 3 calves. At fall prices, that was close to $40. Not catastrophic on its own. Added to everything else, it was another weight on a structure that was already bending. "The fence?" "They came under. I need to reset the bottom rails on a 60-yard stretch." He finally looked up. "A day's work, maybe more." "I can help." He looked at her. She was wearing her work dress and her coat, and the pair of heavy gloves she'd bought in town on the second week because the ones she'd brought from Cincinnati were useless out here. He looked at the gloves for a moment. "You know how to set fence rail?" "No," she said, "but I'm not fragile and I can follow instruction." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite amusement, but something in that neighborhood. He looked back at the tree line. "All right." They spent the day on the fence together, she and Nathan and Cal, Tomas out watching the remaining herd. It was hard, cold, dirty work. Digging the bottom rails free, resetting them deeper, driving posts back into ground that had gone half frozen in the recent cold snap. Her hands ached through the gloves. Her back ached by midday. She did not mention either thing. At some point in the afternoon, Nathan said without preamble, "Helena's husband left her money. Decent amount. She lives in Cheyenne now, has a house with a garden and a housekeeper. He was driving a post with a mallet as he said it, so she couldn't quite read his face. She thinks that matters, that she can give Rose stability, things. Evelyn drove her own post. What does Rose think? Rose is 7. Rose is sharp, Evelyn said. And she has opinions. Nathan glanced at her sideways. She told you that? She told me she doesn't want to go live with her aunt. Evelyn moved to the next post. She told me she knows what Helena wants, and she doesn't want it. He was quiet for a stretch. The mallet came down again. Helena's not a bad person, he said finally. That's the thing that... He stopped. Started again differently. Clara loved her. They were close. After Clara died, Helena came out here and sat with Rose for 2 weeks, and I was... Another stop. I wasn't in a good state. She managed the house and kept Rose fed, and I don't know what would have happened that winter without her. Evelyn heard this carefully. There was something he was moving toward, something underneath the words. But, she said, but she decided somewhere in those 2 weeks that I couldn't do this on my own. And maybe she was right then. But she never updated that opinion. He set the mallet down and looked at the fence line, not at Evelyn. She's been waiting for me to fail, watching for it. Every time something went wrong, the debt, the bad cattle season, the women who didn't stay, she filed that away somewhere, building a case. He picked up the mallet again. I don't think she even knows she's doing it. She thinks she's protecting Rose. She promised Clara she'd protect Rose. The wind came through the pasture and Evelyn pulled her coat tighter. And you think this custody petition is her keeping that promise? I think it's her grief, Nathan said. I think she lost her sister, and she can't. She can't let go of the last thing Clara left behind. So she holds on to Rose instead. And holding on to Rose means... He looked at her then, directly, for the first time in the conversation. Means you're the problem. A stranger. Someone Clara never knew. Evelyn met his eyes. Am I the problem? He didn't answer right away. He looked at her with that measuring expression, the one that was starting to feel familiar. Not comfortable, but familiar, the way a difficult terrain becomes familiar when you've walked it enough times to know where the ground is solid and where it gives. No, he said. Not warmly, but clearly. She nodded and went back to the fence. That evening, after Rose was asleep, Nathan put a bottle of whiskey on the table between them, not offering it, just placing it there, like a fact, and poured 2 glasses and said, I need to tell you something about the debt. She wrapped her hands around the glass and waited. The story came out in pieces, not in order, the way things come out when someone has held them alone for a long time and they've gotten tangled in the holding. Clara had gotten sick in October of 1884. Sick in the way that could go either direction, toward recovery, given the right help, the right doctor, the right conditions. Nathan had sent for the doctor in Laramie, 2 days' ride in summer, but in October of that year the early snow had closed the pass. He'd sent a rider anyway. The rider made it through, but the doctor couldn't. Not with equipment, not with medicine, not in time. Nathan had done what he could. It hadn't been enough. Clara died in November, a month after the first snow, in the bedroom at the back of the house, and Nathan had sat with her through the last 2 nights and hadn't slept and hadn't eaten, and when it was over he had gone outside into the snow and stood there for a long time doing nothing. He didn't say what he did out there in the snow. Evelyn didn't ask. After that, he said, I borrowed against the ranch. Not all at once. A little here, a little there. Feed costs. Repairs I'd been deferring. Hired extra help because I couldn't. I wasn't managing things the way I should have. I told myself I'd recover it. You tell yourself things. He turned the glass in his hands. By the time I understood what the number actually was, it was too large to pretend my way around. $300, Evelyn said. $340. By spring. She thought about this. The fall cattle market. Won't cover it. Not fully. He drank, set the glass down. I've been trying to figure out a way to make it work for 6 months. I haven't found one yet. Have you talked to the bank? Negotiated an extension? He looked at her with a flicker of something. Not offense, but the residue of pride. I've talked to them. And? And they gave me one extension already. They're not inclined to give another. A pause. Henderson at the bank. He's not cruel about it. He has his own obligations. Evelyn thought about the numbers the way she thought about problems, practically, without the emotional interference of what she wished were true. The south pasture, she said. How many acres is it? Nathan frowned. 40, roughly. You're not running cattle on it currently. Not until spring. It's winter grazing land. Could it be leased? Short term through the winter to another rancher who's short on. Nobody has money for lease payments in November. Somebody might, she said, if the price were low enough to be worth it to them. She paused. I'm not saying it covers everything. I'm saying it might cover the gap between what the cattle market brings and what the bank needs. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the lamplight. You've been thinking about this, he said. I've been thinking about it since the day I saw the bank correspondence in the drawer. That drawer was open, she said. You left it open. He made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh, the closest she'd heard from him. Fair enough. He looked at the table. There's a rancher named Birch, southeast of us. He runs more head than his winter pasture can handle. It's possible. He turned the glass again. It's worth asking. I can go with you, she said, if it helps to have someone who can speak to the numbers. He looked at her again. You do that? Why wouldn't I? He didn't answer that, but he stopped looking like the question was something he needed to protect himself from, and that was something. The next morning, Evelyn was in the kitchen at 6 when she heard Rose on the stairs. Not the usual sound of a child coming down for breakfast, but something faster, irregular. She turned from the stove as Rose appeared in the doorway, still in her nightgown, her braid half undone. There's a man on a horse at the gate, Rose said. He's been out there a while. Evelyn dried her hands and went to the window. There was a rider at the far end of the track, not approaching, just sitting there, which was the thing that made it strange, sitting and watching the house. By the time Nathan came downstairs, the rider was gone. Who was it? Rose asked. Don't know, Nathan said. He was looking at the empty track with a particular kind of attention. Did you get a good look at him? He was far away, Rose said. He had a gray coat. Nathan said nothing else about it at breakfast, but Evelyn noticed he went out to the gate afterward and spent some time looking at the track where the rider had been, reading the ground the way he'd read the south pasture fence line. He came back in without reporting what he'd found, and she didn't ask. Not yet. That afternoon, she went into town for supplies. The town was called Ridgeline, small, the way frontier towns were small, which meant it had what it needed and not much more. A general store, a bank, a saloon, a livery, a small courthouse that also served as the post office on certain days of the week. She was loading her parcels into the wagon when a woman she didn't know touched her arm. Miss Hartwell? She turned. The woman was perhaps 50, with a lined face and tired eyes, and the hands of someone who had worked hard for years. She was holding a basket. I'm Margaret Cullen, the woman said. My husband Tom has the spread east of yours. She hesitated. I heard about the Whitaker petition. Evelyn was careful. News travels fast. In a town this size, it always does. She glanced toward the street as though checking who might be nearby. Helena Whitaker came to the Women's Society meeting last month. She spoke about Rose. She was... Margaret Cullen stopped, chose her words. She was persuasive. Several of the women here think she has a point, that Rose should be with family. Evelyn held the woman's eyes. What do you think? Margaret Cullen was quiet for a moment. I think Nathan Blackwood is a man who's had a hard few years and made some mistakes and hasn't been easy to know, but I've never once heard a word against him as a father. She looked at Evelyn steadily. And I think you're being judged by people who haven't spoken to you for 5 minutes. I wanted to tell you that because I thought you should know what you're walking into. It was an act of kindness from a stranger, which was rarer and more valuable than Evelyn showed in her expression. Thank you, she said. I appreciate you telling me. There are people in town who'll support you, if it comes to it. Margaret Cullen shifted her basket. I'm one of them. You should know that too. She walked away before Evelyn could say anything else, and Evelyn stood at the wagon for a moment feeling the peculiar weight of being seen by someone who'd had no particular reason to look. She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the sky going orange and cold above the hills, and she thought about Helena's meeting at the Women's Society and the rider in the gray coat at the gate and the petition in the drawer, and she understood that what was happening was not a single fight with a single front. It was multiple pressures coming at the same time: the debt, the custody hearing, the community opinion, the ranch's fragile economics, and they were connected in a way that Helena might not have designed, but was certainly using. She was quiet at dinner. Nathan noticed. He always noticed things, even when he didn't say so. "What happened in town?" he asked, after Rose had gone upstairs. She told him about Margaret Cullen. She told him what the woman had said about Helena's speech at the Women's Society meeting. Nathan's jaw tightened. "She's building the case." "She's building the case," Evelyn agreed. "Not just in court. Here, in the town." She put her hands flat on the table. "We need to let people see who we are. Not perform it. Actually let them see it." "I'm not going to go around town asking people to speak well of me," Nathan said, with a flatness that made clear this was not a negotiable position. "I'm not asking you to." She met his eyes. "I'm asking you to stop avoiding them. Come to town when there's something to come to. Let people talk to Rose. Let them talk to me." She paused. "You've been keeping this ranch like a fortress. I understand why, but a fortress is just a building that's hard to enter. It doesn't mean anything to anyone outside the walls." He was quiet for a long time. The lamp flame moved. Outside, the wind worked at the eaves. "Clara was the one who handled that," he said finally. "The town, the relationships. She was good at it. I'm not." He said this without self-pity, just as a fact he'd made peace with. "After she died, I stopped going unless I had to. I know. I don't know how to..." He stopped. "I'm not who she was." "I'm not asking you to be her," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you to show up. That's different." He looked at her for a moment. "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "Showing up just means you're there. The rest comes from being there." He didn't say anything for a while. He looked at the table and she let him look, let the silence do its work, because she had learned that Nathan Blackwood processed things in silence, and crowding him out of it didn't help. "The Birch Ranch," he said finally. "I'll ride over there day after tomorrow, if you want to come." It was not an answer to what she'd said, but it was a yes to something, and she took it. 3 days later, they rode together to Birch's spread, and Nathan talked about the lease in the careful, minimal way he talked about money, and Evelyn filled in the numbers when they were needed and didn't speak when they weren't. And by the end of an hour, Birch had agreed to a winter lease on the south pasture at a price that wasn't good, but was real. On the way back to Blackwood Ranch, Nathan didn't say much, but somewhere on the last mile he said, without looking at her, "You knew exactly what to say in there." "I knew what the numbers said," Evelyn answered. "That's what I mean." He rode for another few strides. Clara would have gotten him to agree, and had him feeling good about it. That was her way. A pause. "You got him to agree and had him feeling like he'd made a smart decision. That's different." He glanced at her sideways. "It worked just as well." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an observation. She decided it didn't matter which it was. What mattered was that it was honest. Everything honest between them felt like ground being laid plank by plank, across something that had previously been open water. It wasn't solid yet. It shifted when you stepped on it. But it was there. The trouble that arrived on a Wednesday morning came not from Helena, not from the bank, but from something Evelyn hadn't accounted for. She was outside with Rose. The girl had decided she wanted to teach Evelyn to identify the different bird calls that came from the hills east of the ranch, a project that Rose took entirely seriously and that Evelyn engaged with in the same spirit. When she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see not one rider, but 3 coming up the track. Helena was in the middle. The 2 riders flanking her were men she didn't recognize, not ranch hands from their dress, not cowboys. The man on Helena's right had a leather satchel across his saddle. "Lawyer," Evelyn thought immediately. Rose went very still beside her. Nathan came out of the barn. He'd heard them too. He walked to the gate and stood there with his arms at his sides, and Evelyn took Rose by the shoulder and moved to stand beside him, not in front of him and not behind him. Helena reined up. She looked at the three of them standing at the gate, Evelyn and Nathan and Rose, and something moved across her face that Evelyn couldn't fully name. Not cruelty, not triumph. Something more complicated than either, almost like grief wearing the wrong expression. "Nathan," Helena said. "Helena." He kept his voice even. "Didn't know you were coming." I thought it was time to speak plainly. She glanced at the man with the satchel. "This is Mr. Aldrich. He's representing me in the court matter." "I know who he is," Nathan said. Aldrich looked at Nathan with the careful blankness of a professional. "Mr. Blackwood, I want to be direct with you. We believe we have a strong case. The court will consider the child's welfare above all other factors, and we believe Mrs. Whitaker is positioned to provide—" "Mr. Aldrich," Evelyn said. He stopped, looked at her with mild surprise, as though a fence post had spoken. "This is a private ranch, and you've arrived without invitation," she said. Her voice was level. "If you have something to present, the appropriate place to present it is in court. You know that." Aldrich recovered quickly. "You must be Miss Hartwell." "I am." "Your presence here is actually part of what we intend to address. In court," she said again, "where there's a judge and a record and a proper process." She looked at Helena. "Helena, if you want to speak to Nathan about Rose, that's a different matter. But bringing a lawyer to the house to pressure him isn't speaking. It's something else." Helena's jaw tightened. For a moment, the two women looked at each other directly across the gate, not as antagonists exactly, but as two people who both understood what this was really about, underneath the legal maneuvering and the property lines and the formal language. "I want what's best for Rose," Helena said. Her voice had dropped. Some of the formality had gone out of it. "So do we," Evelyn said. "That's not actually the disagreement." Something flickered in Helena's eyes. She looked at Rose, who was standing with Evelyn's hand on her shoulder, watching her aunt with those careful, watchful eyes. "Rose," Helena said more softly, "don't you want to come visit? I'm going to stay here," Rose said. Not defiant, not dramatic, just plain and certain, the way she said most things. Helena looked at her niece for a long moment. Something moved in her face that might have been love, and might have been the particular pain of love that can't find the right shape to take. She turned her horse without another word. Aldrich gave Nathan a measured look that communicated volumes about forthcoming court dates and documentation, and then the three of them rode back down the track the way they'd come. The dust settled. Nathan let out a breath that he'd been holding since they arrived. Rose looked up at Evelyn. "You weren't scared of them," Rose said. "I was a little scared," Evelyn said honestly. Rose considered this. "You didn't show it." "No," Evelyn agreed. "I didn't." Nathan looked at her sideways. She could feel him looking. She didn't turn to meet it, just watched the track until the riders disappeared around the tree line. That evening, she found Nathan in the barn after dinner, checking on a mare who'd been off her feed. He didn't say anything when she came in, just moved over slightly to make room near the stall, and she stood beside him in the smell of hay and horses and the quiet sounds of animals settling for the night. After a while, he said, "You didn't have to do that. Step in like that." "I know." Aldrich was going to say something useful about the case, what they're planning. "Aldrich was going to frighten you," she said. "And you don't need to be frightened. You need to be steady. There's a difference." He was quiet. The mare shifted in the stall. "I keep waiting," he said, "for you to realize what you got yourself into." She looked at him. In the low light of the barn, with his hat pushed back and his face showing more than he usually let it show, he looked less like the guarded, armored man he performed for the outside world, and more like what he actually was. Someone who had been through something terrible and had survived it, but hadn't come all the way back from it yet, and who was not sure, after everything, that he deserved to come back. "I know what I got myself into," she said. "I've been here long enough to know. It's been less than a month. I know how long it's been." She met his eyes. "You keep telling me how long it's been, like it's a reason I should leave. It's not." He held her gaze for a moment that cost him something. She could see that it cost him something, that just standing there and letting himself be seen without deflecting. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. The mare moved again, and Nathan turned back to the stall, and Evelyn stayed a while longer in the quiet of the barn, listening to the wind working at the roof, and thought about Helena's face when Rose said she was staying, thought about the grief in it that had nowhere to land. She thought, this is going to get worse before it gets better. She was right. She just didn't know yet how much worse, or where it would come from, or what it would cost each of them before it was done. But she was still there, still in the barn, in the cold, on the far edge of the Wyoming territory, a month from everything she'd known. Still there. That was what she had. And for now she had decided it was enough. The hearing was 4 weeks out when the second wolf attack hit the north pasture. This one was worse. Not in numbers, only one calf lost, but in what it meant for the fence line Nathan had spent 3 days rebuilding after the first attack. The wolves had found a different entry point, farther east, which meant either the pack was larger than he'd thought, or they were learning the ranch's perimeter the way a patient problem learns its target. Nathan rode the full fence line the morning after and came back to the house with mud to his knees and a look on his face that Evelyn had come to recognize as the specific expression of a man who is doing arithmetic he doesn't like the result of. He didn't say anything at breakfast. Rose watched him across the table with those careful eyes and didn't say anything either. After Rose went upstairs to get her coat for the walk to the neighbor's house, where she did her lessons 3 mornings a week, Nathan said, I need to pull Cal off the south pasture to watch the north fence at night, which means the Birch cattle on the south lease are going to be short a hand. Birch knew the arrangement was lean when he agreed to it, Evelyn said. Knowing it and having a problem with it are 2 different things. If his animals have trouble on my land because I'm short-staffed, he has grounds to end the lease early. Nathan pushed his plate back, which removes the one payment that might bridge the gap to spring. Evelyn thought about this. The arithmetic was tight, and she'd been living inside it long enough to feel its edges clearly. I can watch the south boundary during the days. That frees Cal to move. Nathan looked at her. It's cold work, hours of it. I know what it is. Evelyn, Nathan. She met his eyes steadily. I'm not made of something that breaks in cold weather. Let me help. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at the window where the morning was coming in flat and gray. I'll think about it, he said, which she had learned meant yes, but he needed time to get there on his own. She let him have the time. What she didn't tell him was that she had already been thinking about something else, something larger than the fence line and the wolf pack and even the birch lease. She had been thinking about the court hearing and what it would look like to a judge, not the legal arguments, not the documentation, but the human picture of it. A judge in Laramie County would see Nathan's debt on paper. He would see Helena Whitaker's money and her Cheyenne house and her lawyer. He would see Evelyn Hartwell, who had arrived from Ohio 40-some days ago and had no history in the territory, no property, no community connections beyond one conversation in a general store with Margaret Cullen. What he needed to see instead was something that paper couldn't carry. She walked into town that afternoon on the pretext of supplies they didn't urgently need, and she stopped at the general store not to buy anything but to talk to the owner, a man named Haskell, who had the particular value of knowing everyone and being known by everyone in a 20-mile radius. She had spoken to him twice before, briefly, and he had been polite and watchful and non-committal in the way of men who manage community relationships carefully and don't spend their goodwill without thinking about it. She didn't ask him for anything directly. She talked to him about Rose's lessons and about the birch lease and about the south pasture fence line, and she talked about these things the way you talk about your own life, matter-of-factly, with the specific detail that comes from being in the middle of something rather than observing it from outside. She talked about Nathan, the way she'd come to understand him, not as a performance, but as the truth. A difficult man, a grieving man, a man who didn't ask for help even when help was the only thing that would work. Haskell listened with the quality of attention that good listeners have, not performing attention, actually paying it. When she was done, he said, Helena Whitaker came in here 2 weeks ago. I know, Evelyn said. She's been thorough. She said some things about the ranch, about the debt. He paused. About you. I imagine she did. Evelyn kept her voice even. What did she say about me? That you were a mail-order arrangement, that Nathan had no real knowledge of your character. He said it plainly, without cruelty. That a stranger from Cincinnati with no roots here wasn't the right person to be raising a Wyoming child. Evelyn absorbed this. She's not entirely wrong about the facts. Haskell raised an eyebrow. I did come from Cincinnati. Nathan and I didn't know each other before I arrived. Those things are true. She looked at him. What's not true is the conclusion she draws from them. Plenty of people in this territory started as strangers. That's how territory works. Haskell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My wife came out from Pennsylvania, 1871. She didn't know anyone within 300 miles. A pause. Took about a year before people stopped treating her like a visitor. I may not have a year, Evelyn said. He nodded slowly. No, I expect you don't. He looked at her with the directness of a man making a decision. I'll tell you what I told the 3 men who asked me about it last week. I said I didn't know enough yet to have an opinion either way. That's the honest answer. He met her eyes. You give me a reason to have an opinion, and I'll have one. It was not a promise. It was an opening, which was all she'd come for. She walked back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sky pulling dark ahead of a weather front coming in from the north, and she thought about opinions and about what built them and about how much time she did and didn't have. The weather front arrived that night, and by morning there were 4 inches of snow on the ground with more coming. Nathan went out at first light and came back an hour later to report that the north fence had held, but the temperature was dropping in a way that made him concerned about the herd. He spent the day out with Cal and Tomas, moving cattle to the more sheltered sections of the pasture, and Evelyn managed the house and kept the stove fed and had food ready when the men came in at dark, exhausted and frostburned and mostly silent. Rose helped without being asked. She set the table and carried the water basin to the men for washing and sat quietly through dinner in the way she sat when she understood the adults around her were carrying something heavy and talk would not help it. After dinner, when Nathan was warming his hands at the stove and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Rose appeared at Evelyn's elbow with a question she'd clearly been holding all day. Are we going to lose the ranch? She asked. Evelyn looked at Nathan. He had his back to them, still facing the stove. No, Evelyn said. How do you know? Because we're going to make sure we don't. Rose considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Helena thinks we will, she said. I heard her tell Mr. Aldrich that the court would see... She stopped. Nathan turned from the stove. Where did you hear that? In the yard, when they came that day. Before you came out of the barn. I was behind the water barrel. Rose looked at her father without apology. I wasn't hiding on purpose. I was just already there. Nathan's jaw tightened, but not with anger at Rose. Evelyn could read the difference now. The tightness was the particular kind that came from hearing something you'd suspected confirmed out loud. What did she say? He asked. His voice was careful. She told Mr. Aldrich that the judge would see a failing ranch and a woman who had no reason to stay once things got hard. Rose said this precisely, like a child who has memorized words she knew were important. She said you'd run out of money, and then Evelyn would leave, and then you'd have no choice. The room was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the table. She felt Nathan's eyes on the side of her face, but she didn't turn toward him. She was thinking about Helena saying those words. Not cruelly, probably, but with the certainty of someone who had watched people leave before and had learned to predict it. Rose, Nathan said carefully, go up to bed. I'm not tired. I know. Go anyway. Rose looked at Evelyn, then at her father, then made the calculation that children make when they understand that the adults need the room more than they need company. She went upstairs without argument, which was itself a kind of maturity that made Evelyn's chest ache slightly. The quiet after her footsteps faded was a different kind of quiet than before. She's not wrong, Nathan said. Evelyn looked at him then. Helena? About the pattern. He moved from the stove to the table and sat, not across from her, but at the end, the way you sit when you want to be in the conversation but aren't sure you should be. 2 women before you, both left. Both of them left because he stopped. Started differently. I'm not easy to be around. I know that. And the ranch is... He spread his hands on the table. It's a hard life. It was always a hard life. Clara understood that because she grew up in it. But women from outside... Nathan, Evelyn said. He stopped. I know what Helena thinks, she said. I know what the pattern looked like. I know what I look like on paper to a judge who doesn't know me. She held his eyes. None of that is the same as what's actually true. What is actually true? He asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking, the way a man asks something he has stopped trusting his own answer to. She thought about Cincinnati, about the empty platform, about the $42 and the 4-day train ride, and the 2 weeks of learning how to reset fence rails and read cattle numbers and navigate a man who communicated in silences more than words. She thought about Rose's arms around her waist on the first day, shaking. What's true, she said, is that I'm here, and I'm still here, and I intend to keep being here. She paused. That's all the truth that matters right now. He looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them put light on his face and shadow in the lines around his eyes, and she thought again that he looked less like the guarded man he'd been on that first day, and more like someone who was slowly, cautiously, putting down a weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. Okay, he said. Just that. Okay. But the way he said it was different from the way he'd said it before. Not a deflection, not a half agreement offered to end a conversation. It sounded like something meant. She nodded and got up to clear the dishes, and he didn't leave the table. He sat there while she moved around the kitchen, not helping but not retreating either. And it was a small thing, but it was not nothing. The hearing date was 3 weeks out when everything shifted. The morning was ordinary at its beginning. Nathan left early with Cal to check on the herd after the previous night's cold. Tomas was mending tack in the barn. Evelyn was inside working on the supply accounts when she became aware. In the gradual way you become aware of a sound that shouldn't be there, that Rose was not in the house. She'd heard her upstairs when Nathan left. She hadn't heard her come down. She checked the kitchen, the parlor, the yard. She checked the barn, where Tomas looked up with the blankness of someone who hadn't seen the child all morning. She checked the garden side of the house, the woodpile area, the outhouse. Rose was not on the property. There was a sick drop in Evelyn's stomach. Not panic, not yet, but the thing that precedes panic when you're trying hard to hold it back. She went back to the barn. Tomas, she said, which horse is the gentlest? The one she could handle alone. Tomas stared at her. Miss, which horse? He looked at the stalls. The roan gelding, Copper, but she knows she's not supposed to. Evelyn was already looking at the stalls. Copper was gone. She stood there for 3 seconds, doing the arithmetic of it. Where would Rose go? Which direction? How long ago? Rose had mentioned twice in the past week that she wanted to see Evelyn when Evelyn came into town. She had also mentioned Helena once, with a specific look that suggested she'd been thinking about the hearing and the things she'd overheard behind the water barrel and had formed some kind of private plan she hadn't shared. The road to Ridgeline was 7 miles. Rose had ridden it with Nathan, never alone. Saddle a horse, Evelyn said to Tomas, and ride out to wherever Nathan is and tell him Rose took Copper this morning. Tell him I've gone toward town. Ma'am, the trail? Tell him, she said, and went to get her coat. She rode hard for the first mile, then pulled back to something sustainable and tried to think past the fear. Rose was a capable rider for her age. Nathan had taught her, and Nathan didn't do things incompletely. The trail to Ridgeline was well-defined. The weather had cleared and the snow was packed enough to hold a horse's footing. None of this meant the ride was safe for a 7-year-old alone. And Evelyn knew it, and she put the knowledge in a box and closed the box and focused on the trail. She found Copper's tracks in the packed snow after the second creek crossing, small, regular, unhurried. Rose had not been galloping. She'd been riding with intention, at a pace she could manage. This was either reassuring or more worrying, depending on how you looked at it. Evelyn chose reassuring because she needed to keep her head clear, and panic wasn't useful out here with nobody to hear it. 4 miles from the ranch, the tracks turned off the main trail. Evelyn pulled up and looked at the diverging prints. The smaller tracks went east, away from town. She sat on her horse in the cold and tried to understand why. And then she remembered. 3 weeks ago, over dinner, Rose had talked about the ridge east of the trail, a high point where you could see the whole valley, the ranch, the town, everything at once. She'd mentioned it the way children mention places they've stored as important. Evelyn turned east. She found Rose on the ridge 20 minutes later, sitting on a flat rock with Copper tied to a scrub pine behind her, looking out at the valley below. The girl didn't startle when she heard Evelyn's horse. She just turned and looked, and there was something in her expression that was not guilt and not defiance, but the particular look of someone who has been thinking hard about something and has reached a conclusion. Evelyn dismounted and tied her horse. She climbed the last stretch of rock and sat beside Rose without saying anything for a moment, because the view warranted the silence. The valley wide below them, the ranch a cluster of gray-roofed buildings in the white distance, ridgeline barely visible to the west. The whole enormous silence of the territory laid out like it didn't have an edge. "You scared me," Evelyn said finally. "I'm sorry," Rose said. She meant it. "Why did you come here?" Rose was quiet. She looked at the valley. "I wanted to see it all at once," she said. "Everything, the ranch, the town, where we are." She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "When Helena talks about taking me to Cheyenne, I can't see it. What she's talking about, it's just words." She looked at Evelyn. "But I can see this. I know where everything is from here." Evelyn looked at the valley. She understood what Rose was saying, the way you understand something that hasn't been said in words before, but is exactly true once you hear it. "You're trying to hold on to it," she said. "I'm afraid that after the hearing, I won't be able to come back here," Rose said. Her voice was steady in the way children's voices are steady when they're saying something they've accepted but haven't finished grieving. "I'm afraid they'll decide and then it'll be too late, and I won't even have looked at it properly." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. She didn't rush to reassure her because she'd come to understand that Rose deserved better than rushed reassurance. She deserved honest. "The hearing isn't the end of everything," Evelyn said. "Whatever happens at the hearing, we keep fighting. That's how this works." "But what if the judge agrees with Helena?" "Then we appeal. Then we find another judge." She looked at Rose directly. "I told you I was staying. That doesn't have a condition on it. It doesn't stop being true because a court says something." Rose looked at her. "You could, though. If Helena wins, you wouldn't have any reason to stay anymore." "I'd have a reason," Evelyn said. "What reason?" "You," she said simply. "And your father. And this." She gestured at the valley, at the ranch in the white distance. "I didn't cross the country for a reason that disappears because things get hard." Rose was quiet for a long time, looking at the valley. Then she said, "My mother used to bring me up here, before she died." She said it plainly, without performance. She said it was the best view in the territory and she wasn't going to let me grow up without knowing it. Evelyn felt the weight of that, not painfully, but with the particular weight of a truth that asks you to hold it carefully. "She sounds like she was someone worth knowing." "She was," Rose said. "She was better at everything than most people." A pause. "She would have been better at this than you are." It landed squarely, the way Rose's honest statements always landed. Evelyn didn't flinch from it. "She probably would have," she said. "She knew this place. She knew your father. She knew you from the beginning." She looked at the valley. "I don't have any of that. I'm working from behind." Rose looked at her. "But you're still working." "Yes?" The girl nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed. She looked back at the valley for a moment longer, and then she stood up and brushed the snow off her coat. "We should go back," she said. "Papa's going to be upset." "He is," Evelyn agreed, standing. "Are you going to tell him what I said? About my mother being better?" "No," Evelyn said. Rose looked at her with a measuring look that was startlingly adult. "Why not?" "Because it was a private conversation," Evelyn said. "Between you and me. He doesn't need to know every word of it." Rose absorbed this. Then she nodded, and the nod had something in it, some small shift, some infinitesimal adjustment in what she was deciding about Evelyn, that Evelyn felt more than saw. They rode back together in the thin winter light, Evelyn matching her pace to Copper's smaller stride, and when the ranch came into view there were 3 horses in the yard. Nathan back already, and Tomas beside him. Even at distance, even with his hat pulled low, Evelyn could read Nathan's body. The rigid set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man holding himself in careful check around something that had terrified him. He came to meet them at the gate. He looked at Rose first, a fast total inventory, checking her the way you check something precious you almost lost, cataloging that she was whole. And then his jaw hardened and the relief collapsed into something else. Rose? His voice was very controlled. Get down. Go inside. Rose dismounted without argument. She looked at her father's face and then at Evelyn's face, and then went to the house without a word. Nathan stood holding Copper's bridle with one hand, his other hand pressed flat against his thigh. He was breathing carefully. He looked up at Evelyn still on her horse. She was on the ridge, Evelyn said. The one east of the trail. She's fine. She was never in real danger. She was 7 years old on that trail alone. The controlled voice had a crack in it now, something raw underneath. She's never ridden it by herself. The creek crossing, if the ice held, Evelyn said. She made good choices about her pace and her route. She dismounted. She was scared, Nathan, not about the trail, about the hearing. He looked at her. She rode up to the ridge because she wanted to see the valley, all of it, the ranch, the town. She was afraid that after the hearing she wouldn't. Evelyn paused. She was afraid she was going to lose it, and she wanted to look at it properly before she did. Something moved through Nathan's face. The hard-controlled anger didn't disappear, but something behind it shifted, some recognition of what Rose had actually done and why, which was different from the danger of it. He stood there with Copper's bridle in his hand and his jaw tight, and his eyes showing more than he intended them to show. She's not going to lose it, he said, low, like a statement made to himself as much as to Evelyn. I know that, Evelyn said. She doesn't know it yet, not completely. He was quiet. You need to tell her, Evelyn said. Not me. You. She needs to hear it from you, and she needs to hear it like you mean it, not like you're saying it to manage her. He looked at her sharply. I don't manage her. You protect her, Evelyn said, from hard things, from the details of the debt and the hearing and all of it, which makes sense because she's 7. But she knows more than you think she knows. And the gap between what she knows and what you've told her, that's where the fear lives. He held her eyes. She could see him resisting it and then, slowly, not resisting it. She's a child, he said. She's your child, Evelyn said. And she's sharp, and she's watching everything, and she went and sat on a ridge alone in the cold because she didn't know who else to ask. She kept her voice level. Talk to her. He put Copper in the barn. When he came back out, he went to the house without looking at Evelyn again, but she heard from the yard the sound of his boots on the stairs. Not the usual sound of a man going to bed or getting something from upstairs, but slower, deliberate. The sound of someone deciding to do something he had been putting off. She stayed in the yard for a while, letting the cold work at her face, listening to the wind come down from the hills. Inside, through the walls, she couldn't hear words, just the murmur of voices, lower, higher, lower again. At one point, a sound that might have been a child crying quickly stopped. She stayed outside until it was fully dark and her hands were numb. When she came inside, Nathan was in the kitchen. He had made coffee, badly. It was too strong, and he'd let it sit too long. And he was drinking it anyway, standing at the counter. He didn't look at her when she came in, but he said, She's asleep. Good. She told me things. He paused. About being afraid. Things I didn't. He stopped. I thought she was handling it better than she was. She handles things in front of you because she doesn't want you to worry, Evelyn said. She worries about your worry. He looked at his coffee. That's... He shook his head. She's 7. I know. He was quiet for a stretch, then, I told her we were going to win the hearing. Are you sure? No. He finally looked at her. But I told her we were going to fight like we were sure, and that you weren't going anywhere, and that this was her home. He set the cup down. She asked me if you were going to be her mother. Evelyn went very still. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't know yet, he said, that it was too soon for that word, but that you were someone who had chosen to be here, And that was, he looked away, that was its own thing, that it mattered its own way. She stood in the kitchen doorway and felt the full weight of where she was. In this house, in this territory, in this life that had started as an advertisement in a Cincinnati newspaper 6 months ago and had become something she couldn't have mapped or predicted or prepared herself for. That was the right answer, she said. He nodded. Then, Aldrich sent a letter today. The hearing has been moved. 2 weeks. The arithmetic shifted instantly in her head. 2 weeks, not 3. The Birch lease payment was due in 10 days. The community, Haskell, Margaret Cullen, whoever else might be persuaded, had less time than she'd been working with. All right, she said. Nathan looked at her. That's all right? What do you want me to say? It's 2 weeks. We work with 2 weeks. She met his eyes. We were going to have to do all of this anyway. We just do it faster. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she'd been learning all these weeks. The one she'd thought at first was suspicion, but had come to understand was something more complicated. Something closer to a man confronting evidence that contradicted what he'd decided to believe about the world. You're different from... He stopped himself. From the others who left? She said. From what I expected, he said. And then, because Nathan Blackwood didn't say things he didn't mean. For most people. She held his gaze and did not look away. The kitchen was cold despite the stove, and the coffee was terrible, and there were 2 weeks until a hearing that could go any number of directions, and the wolves were still somewhere out in the north pasture, and $340 was due in spring. None of it had resolved. None of it had been fixed or smoothed over or made easier than it actually was. But she was still in the doorway, and he was still at the counter, and neither of them was leaving. That was the truth of where they were. Not romance, not resolution, just two imperfect people standing in the same kitchen in the middle of a hard season, deciding, for reasons they might not have been able to fully articulate, to keep going. Outside, the wind came down from the northern hills and worked at the house the way it always did. Steadily, without malice, without any particular feeling about the people inside. The house held. The 2 weeks collapsed faster than Evelyn had expected, not because they were easy, but because they were full. Every day carrying its own specific weight, its own small crisis or negotiation or quiet moment that mattered more than it appeared to on the surface. The Birch lease payment came in on the 9th day, and Nathan rode to the bank in Ridgeline the following morning and made a partial payment on the debt that reduced what they owed to something that was still serious but was no longer immediately catastrophic. Henderson at the bank, a careful man, not unkind, noted the payment in his ledger and told Nathan that the remaining balance would need to be addressed by April and that he appreciated the good faith. Nathan came home and told Evelyn this in the kitchen, standing, still in his coat, and she noted the word he'd used when he reported what Henderson said. Good faith. She knew that mattered to Nathan in a way that was deeper than the money. She spent those 2 weeks doing what she'd told Haskell she intended to do, being visible. She came to town when she had reason and stayed a little longer than the errand required. She spoke to people when they spoke to her and didn't perform warmth she didn't feel, but also didn't hold herself at the careful remove she'd maintained in the first weeks when she was still learning where everything was. She helped Margaret Cullen carry a broken chair to the joiner's shop when she saw her struggling with it outside the general store, and spent 20 minutes talking with her afterward. Not about the hearing, not about Helena, just about the territory and the winter and how Margaret's husband Tom was managing his cattle through the cold snap. Normal conversation. The kind that builds something without appearing to build anything. She understood what she was doing, and she wasn't ashamed of it. She was making herself real to people who had only heard about her secondhand through Helena's careful framing. That wasn't manipulation. That was just showing up, the way she told Nathan it needed to be done. What she hadn't anticipated was the wardrobe. It happened 5 days before the hearing, on a morning when Nathan was out early, and Rose was at her lessons, and Evelyn was doing the kind of thorough cleaning of the upstairs rooms that had been deferred through the busy weeks. She was working through the spare bedroom, the one that had been used for storage since Clara died, by the look of it, boxes of things that hadn't been sorted or moved, when she opened the large wardrobe in the corner and found, folded in tissue paper on the upper shelf, a dress. She knew immediately whose it was. Not because she recognized it. She'd never seen Clara Blackwood wear anything, but because of the care with which it was stored, the particular reverence of the folding, and because it was the nicest thing in the room by a considerable margin. Dark green wool with small cream buttons at the collar, well made, the kind of dress you wore for occasions that mattered. She lifted it carefully from the shelf, just to move it so she could clean behind the wardrobe, and held it in her hands for a moment. The dress was lighter than she expected. It smelled faintly of cedar from the wardrobe boards, and underneath that, very faintly, something she couldn't identify. Not a perfume, just the particular smell of fabric that has belonged to a specific person for years. She stood there longer than she meant to. This was the woman Nathan had loved. This was Rose's mother. This was the person whose absence was the architecture of this entire household, the empty chair, the bare walls, the way Nathan went silent at certain moments, the way Rose sometimes looked at the photograph above the fireplace with an expression that was past grief and into something more like a sustained, settled ache. Evelyn was not a jealous woman. She knew that about herself. But standing there with the dress in her hands, she felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not jealousy, not inadequacy exactly, but something adjacent to both. A specific awareness of the shape of what she was not and could never be. Clara had known this land and this house and this man from the inside. She had been the reason the house had curtains on the windows and a cloth on the table, back when it did. She had been the one who brought Rose up to the ridge to show her the valley because she didn't want her daughter to grow up without knowing the best view in the territory. Evelyn had arrived 50-some days ago with $42 in a carpet bag. She sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding the dress, and thought with an honesty that surprised her. What if I do all of this? Fight Helena? Hold the ranch together? Show up every single day? And it still isn't enough? What if I win everything there is to win and still never belong here the way she did? It was not a question she'd let herself ask before. She had been too busy for it, which was partly why she'd kept herself busy. Out here, in the quiet room with the dress in her hands, there was nothing between her and the question. She heard the stairs and looked up. Rose stood in the doorway, still in her coat from lessons, looking at Evelyn and then at the dress in her hands. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, cycled through several things quickly before settling into something calm and considered. That was hers, Rose said. I know. I'm sorry. I was cleaning and I opened the wardrobe and it's all right. Rose came into the room. She didn't reach for the dress. She just stood near Evelyn and looked at it. Papa put it up there after she died. He couldn't... She stopped. He looked at it too much, so he put it away. Evelyn held the dress carefully, the way you hold something that belongs to someone else. She wore it to the Ridgeline Harvest dinner, Rose said. The year before she got sick. I remember because she let me touch the buttons. A pause. I thought they were the most beautiful buttons I'd ever seen. Evelyn looked at the small cream buttons. They were well made, not fancy. The kind of buttons a woman chose because they would last. She sounds like she was someone who chose things carefully, Evelyn said. She was. Rose sat beside her on the bed. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, Evelyn waited because she'd learned that Rose's silences usually contained something worth waiting for. You don't have to become my mother, Rose said. Evelyn looked at her. I already had one, Rose said. Her voice was even. Not cold. It was the evenness of someone who has arrived somewhere true. I don't need you to be her. She looked at the dress, and then at Evelyn. I just need someone who won't disappear. The words went into Evelyn like something set down after long carrying. She sat with them for a moment and didn't try to answer them too quickly because they deserved better than a quick answer. I won't disappear, she said. You don't know that, Rose said. Not accusingly, just accurately. You can't know for sure. No, Evelyn agreed. I can't promise what the future does, but I can tell you what I intend. And I intend to stay. She looked at Rose directly. That's the only true thing I have to offer. Not a guarantee. Just an intention I mean completely. Rose looked at her for a long moment with those eyes that were Clara's eyes, and nobody else's. Then she nodded. The small, serious nod that meant she had taken something in and was keeping it. We should put it back, Rose said, nodding at the dress. Yes, Evelyn said. She folded it carefully, not the same as it had been folded before. She couldn't replicate that exactly, but with the same care. She put it back on the shelf and closed the wardrobe door. Rose helped her finish the cleaning of the room without being asked. They didn't talk about the dress again or about what Rose had said, but the conversation stayed in the room with them in the way that true things do. Not heavy, not urgent, just present. That evening, Evelyn told Nathan she'd cleaned the spare room. He looked at her with a question in his face that he didn't ask directly. "I found the wardrobe," she said. "I didn't disturb anything. I left it the way I found it." He looked away. "That room's been closed up for 2 years." "I know. I thought it needed airing." She paused. "Rose came in while I was there." He looked back at her. "She was all right," Evelyn said. "She handled it." She held his eyes. "She's more all right than you think she is, Nathan. She grieves, but she's not broken by it. She's stronger than you're giving her credit for." He was quiet. He had the expression of a father confronted with evidence that his child has grown in ways he hasn't fully registered. "She said something to me," Evelyn said. "I'm not going to repeat it exactly, but she was clear about what she needs, and it wasn't a replacement." She paused. "Just a person who stays." Nathan looked at the floor. When he looked up, his face had that compromised quality, like something had cracked in the ice, not broken through, just cracked. "She gets that from Clara," he said. "The directness." "I think she gets some of it from you," Evelyn said. He made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else entirely, and then he looked away, and she let him. The night before the hearing, nobody slept well. Evelyn lay in her room listening to the house settle in the cold and ran through the shape of it. What Aldrich would argue, what the judge would consider, what they had on their side and what they didn't. She had spoken to Tom Cullen 2 days earlier, and he had agreed to appear and speak on Nathan's behalf regarding the ranch's management and character. Haskell had agreed to write a letter, which was something. A letter from the man who knew everyone carried weight in Laramie County Court. Margaret Cullen had spoken to 2 other women from the territory who had watched Evelyn over the past weeks and were willing to say, if asked, that she had presented herself as a responsible presence at Blackwood Ranch. It was not a large coalition, but it was real, and it was local, and it had been built in 6 weeks out of nothing. She heard Nathan's boots on the floor above her at 2 a.m, not moving anywhere, just shifting, the sound of a man awake and staying put. She heard Rose's door once, at 3. The child getting up for water, she thought, and then the quiet sound of her going back. She got up at 5 and made breakfast, and when Nathan came downstairs, he looked like he'd slept about as well as she had, which was not much. "Eat," she said. He ate. Rose came down and ate with the focus of a child who understands the day is serious and is trying to be as small a problem as possible, which was its own kind of heartbreaking. They drove the wagon into Ridgeline together, the 3 of them on the seat, and the morning was cold and clear, and the valley looked exactly the way it had looked from the ridge. Enormous, white, indifferent to what happened in the small courthouse at its western edge. The courthouse was already busy when they arrived. Laramie County hearings drew people the way most public events did in towns this size. Not prurient exactly, but the territory didn't offer much in the way of spectacle, and a custody dispute with a new outside woman involved was more interesting than most. Evelyn had dressed carefully, not to impress, but to be legible. A dark skirt, her best blouse, her coat pressed as well as she could press it. She looked, she hoped, like what she was, a capable woman in a serious situation. Helena was already inside with Aldrich. She was dressed well, as always. The good coat, the kind of hat that communicated Cheyenne money to a room full of people who didn't have Cheyenne money. She looked at Nathan when he came in and gave him a nod that had grief in it. She looked at Evelyn and gave her nothing, which Evelyn took as a kind of respect. Helena didn't underestimate her anymore, which was better than being dismissed. Rose sat beside Nathan on the bench. She held his hand, which Nathan allowed without comment. The judge was named Harlan Voss, a compact, gray-haired man with the manner of someone who had been in this room for many years and had learned to read people quickly and without sentiment. He called the hearing to order without ceremony, and Aldrich presented Helena's case with the practiced efficiency of a man who had made similar arguments before and knew which points landed. The debt. The ranch's precarious finances. Nathan Blackwood's isolation from the community in the years since his wife's death. The fact that the woman now living in the household had arrived less than 2 months prior, with no established connection to the territory, no property, no history in the county. Evelyn listened to this without expression. She had prepared herself for it. The facts were true. The interpretation was not. When it was Nathan's turn, he stood and spoke in the careful, minimal way he spoke when he was working to keep emotion out of his voice, which was most of the time. He said that Rose was his daughter, and this was her home, and he had made mistakes in the 2 years after Clara died, but he had not stopped being a father, and he did not intend to stop. He said the debt was being addressed, and the ranch was not failing. He said Evelyn Hartwell had come to Blackwood Ranch with clear intent, and had demonstrated her character through her work and her care for Rose, and that she was not a temporary arrangement. He said that last part looking at Evelyn, briefly, before looking back at the judge. Tom Cullen spoke for 3 minutes and was credible and specific. Haskell's letter was read into the record. Another rancher named McPhail, who Evelyn had not spoken to and who surprised her by appearing at all, stood and said that he'd done business with Nathan Blackwood for 8 years and found him a man of his word. Then Judge Voss looked at Evelyn and said, "Miss Hartwell, you may speak if you'd like." She stood. She had not prepared a speech. She had thought about what she might say, but she had decided against preparing it in the formal sense, because prepared speeches from this kind of witness tended to sound like prepared speeches, and the thing she most needed to convey was the opposite of rehearsed. "I came from Cincinnati," she said. "I answered an advertisement in a newspaper because I was looking for a life that was more than what I had." She let that sit for a moment. "That's not a flattering beginning, but it's an honest one." The room was quiet. "When I arrived at Blackwood Ranch, I met a man who was doing the hardest thing a person can do, managing grief and practical difficulty at the same time, and refusing to let either one beat him. And I met a 7-year-old girl who ran across the yard and wrapped her arms around me because she had been afraid I wouldn't come." She paused. "That child is the most compelling argument for anything I've ever encountered." She looked at the judge directly. "Mrs. Whitaker loves Rose. I don't doubt that. She made a promise to her sister, and she's trying to keep it, and that comes from a place I can't argue with and wouldn't try to." She paused again. "But love and the right answer aren't always the same thing. Rose knows her home, she knows her father, and in 8 weeks she has made clear to me in the direct way she has, in the way that comes from her father, that she knows what she needs. She needs to stay where she is." She looked down for a moment. Not for effect. She genuinely needed the beat. "I didn't come to Wyoming to compete with a woman who died," she said. "I didn't come to replace anyone. I came because a family needed someone, and I was someone who could be there." She looked up. "I'm still there. I intend to keep being there. Not because I'm obligated to, but because I have chosen to, every day, since the day I arrived. That's the only thing I can tell you that matters." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Nathan, beside her, did not look at her, but she felt the shift in him, the slight release of something he had been holding very tightly. Judge Voss looked at his papers. He looked at Helena. He looked at Rose, who was sitting very straight on the bench with Nathan's hand still in hers, watching the judge with the focused attention of someone who understands that what happens in the next few minutes will determine a great deal. Voss said, "Mrs. Whitaker, I'd like to ask you something directly." Helena stood. "Of course." "You've described this household as unstable. In your view, what specifically would constitute stability? What would it take for you to consider Rose's circumstances adequate?" Helena opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Aldrich moved slightly beside her, the subtle movement of a lawyer who is concerned about what his client is about to say. Helena did not look at Aldrich. She looked at the judge, and then, for just a moment, she looked at Rose. Rose looked back at her aunt with those old, steady eyes, and something happened in Helena Whitaker's face that Evelyn had not expected. Not a collapse, not anything dramatic. Just a very quiet giving way, like a current that had been pushing hard against something, and had suddenly found that the thing it was pushing against had moved. "Your Honor," Helena said, and her voice was different from how it had been all morning, lower, less prepared. What I want is for Rose to be safe and loved, and in a home that's going to hold." She paused. I promised her mother I'd make sure of that. And is she those things, in your assessment? Voss asked. Helena looked at Rose, at Nathan's hand around her daughter's, at Evelyn sitting on Nathan's other side. The silence lasted long enough that Aldrich shifted again beside her. I don't know, Helena said finally. I know she was before, when Clara was alive. She stopped. I'm afraid of what happens if I'm wrong. If I let go of this and something goes wrong, if the ranch fails, if this woman leaves, if Nathan can't. She stopped again. Her hands were clasped in front of her and the knuckles had gone white. Clara would want me to be sure. I'm trying to be sure. Mrs. Whitaker, Judge Voss said, not unkindly. You cannot make the future certain. No court can do that for you. Helena looked at him. Something in her expression broke open slightly. Not all the way, not into anything she'd have wanted seen in a public room, but enough that Evelyn, watching her, felt the first real sympathy she'd been able to feel for this woman since the day on the bay horse at the gate. She understood, watching Helena, what Nathan had told her weeks ago in the lamplight. Helena's not a bad person. He had been right. She was a grieving person who had made grief into a project, and the project had carried her this far and was now, in this room, beginning to show her its limits. Judge Voss recessed for 40 minutes. The courthouse emptied partially into the cold air outside, and Evelyn stood near the wagon with Nathan and Rose, none of them saying much. Rose held Evelyn's hand, which she hadn't done in public before, and Evelyn held it back without remark. Across the street, Helena stood with Aldrich. Aldrich was talking quietly, and Helena was not appearing to listen. She was looking at the courthouse steps, at the ground, at her own clasped hands. Then she looked up directly at Evelyn across the width of the street. Evelyn met her eyes and did not look away and did not perform anything. She just looked back, one woman to another, without the legal framing, without the argument. Helena crossed the street. Nathan straightened slightly. Rose went still. Helena stopped in front of them and looked at Evelyn. I want you to understand something, she said. Her voice was quiet, not conciliatory, not hostile, just direct. I don't trust you because I don't know you. I haven't had enough time to know you. I know, Evelyn said. What you said in there, she stopped. You didn't try to take credit for something you haven't earned yet. I haven't earned it, Evelyn said. Not all of it. I've been there 8 weeks. Yes. Helena looked at her for a moment. Clara earned it over years. A pause. I know you're not her. I know that's not... She stopped again, and the control she'd been managing all morning slipped just slightly. I just miss her, and Rose is the last thing that looks like her. That sounds like her. And I'm afraid that if I step back and let this... She gestured vaguely at the three of them. If I let this be and it doesn't work, I'll have nothing. Evelyn looked at this woman, really looked at her, past the lawyer and the petition and the bay horse and the carefully buttoned coat. She said, You'll always have Rose. Whatever the court says today, Rose doesn't stop having an aunt because she lives at Blackwood Ranch. Helena looked at her with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, like a possibility she hadn't considered because she'd been too busy fighting to consider it. I'm not trying to take her from you, Evelyn said. I'm trying to make sure she has a home to come back to. Those aren't the same thing. The recess bell rang from inside. Helena looked at Evelyn for another moment, then at Nathan, then at Rose, who was watching her aunt with those careful eyes and something in her face that was not forgiveness exactly, because nothing had been resolved yet, but was the look of a child who has not closed the door. Helena turned and went back across the street. Judge Voss delivered his ruling 20 minutes later. Rose would remain with Nathan Blackwood. The court found the household stable within the meaning of the statute, noted the evidence of community support, and of the father's active efforts to address the ranch's financial difficulties, and found no grounds to remove the child from her home. He noted, with the carefully neutral phrasing of a man who had been on the bench long enough to say things without saying them, that the child's expressed preference had been considered and found consistent with her welfare. Helena sat very straight during the reading. Aldrich made a note on his papers. When Voss finished, there was a moment of stillness in the room, and then the ambient sounds of people beginning to move and breathe normally again. Rose did not whoop or cry. She pressed her face against Nathan's arm for a moment, just a moment, and then straightened up. Nathan put his hand on the back of her head briefly. Then he stood. He looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything in that moment, which was fine, because the moment didn't need words. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Tom Cullen shook Nathan's hand. Margaret came to Evelyn and squeezed her arm once, firmly, with the wordless efficiency of a woman who expressed things through action rather than speech. Haskell appeared from somewhere and nodded at Nathan with the small nod of a man who is pleased with how something turned out and doesn't feel the need to make a production of it. The world had not transformed. The debt was not gone. The wolves were probably still in the north pasture. The work that needed doing tomorrow would still need doing tomorrow. But Rose climbed up onto the wagon seat between Nathan and Evelyn, and she sat there with the particular ease of a child who is exactly where she is supposed to be. And when they drove out of Ridgeline onto the road that led back to the valley and the ranch, she leaned slightly against Evelyn's arm. Not dramatically, not consciously even, just the small, unconscious lean of a body that has decided somewhere below the level of thought that this is a safe place to rest. Evelyn felt it and did not make a thing of it. She just sat and drove and let the valley come toward them through the cold, clear air. Behind them, the town fell back into its ordinary distances. Ahead, the hills that held Blackwood Ranch came into view in the late afternoon light, gray and familiar, unremarkable to anyone who hadn't spent 8 weeks learning them. To Evelyn, they looked like something else entirely. She didn't have a word for what they looked like. Not yet. The word was still forming, the way things form in territory that's still new, slowly, under pressure, into something that would last. But she felt it. Somewhere under the exhaustion, and the cold, and the long day in the courthouse, and the accounting of everything that still remained undone, she felt something she had not felt on the train platform in Cincinnati, had not felt in the depot waiting rooms that smelled of coal smoke, had not felt in 31 years of being in a place she was not quite sure she was supposed to be. She felt like she was going home. They drove home in the kind of quiet that isn't empty. Rose fell asleep against Evelyn's arm somewhere on the last 2 miles, the way children fall asleep after days of sustained tension, completely, without warning, one moment awake and the next entirely gone. Nathan noticed before Evelyn did and slowed the horses slightly without being asked, so the wagon rode smoother over the rutted track. Evelyn looked at him over the top of Rose's head. He was watching the road. His hands on the reins were relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled looseness of a man managing his grip, but genuinely easy. Something had come out of him in that courthouse and hadn't come back in, and the absence of it changed the shape of his face in a way that was hard to name but was unmistakable. "You all right?" she said quietly. He considered the question the way he considered most things, actually not reflexively. "I think so," he said. "I'm not used to things going the right way." "They don't always," she said. This one did. This one did. He was quiet for a moment. "You're a large part of why." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't the beginning of a speech. It was just a fact he was stating in the plain-spoken way he stated facts, because he had decided it needed to be said, and he was not a man who said things he didn't mean. "We did it together," Evelyn said. "Yes." He looked at the road. "But you knew how." She didn't argue with that, because arguing would have been its own kind of deflection, and she was tired of deflection. She had earned the acknowledgement, and she took it, and that was fine. Rose slept the whole way home. The days after the hearing settled into something that wasn't quite normal. Normal implied a baseline they'd had before, and they hadn't had this before, any of them. What they had instead was a new shape of things, not entirely worked out yet, with rough edges that still needed time and contact to wear smooth. Nathan was different in ways both visible and not. He still didn't talk much. He still went out before light and worked through the day with the focused efficiency of a man who had never learned to be idle. But something in the quality of his silence changed. It was less sealed, less like a door locked from the inside and more like a room that was simply quiet, which is a different thing entirely. He started sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings after Rose went up. Not to talk, particularly. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But he was there, in the room, present in a way he hadn't been in those first weeks when every evening ended with him retreating to wherever he went inside himself and pulling the door shut. Rose noticed. She noticed everything, so of course she noticed this. She made a small comment about it one morning while she was helping Evelyn with the bread. Papa stayed up late last night, said in the neutral, registering tone she used when she was noting something she was pleased about but wasn't going to make a production of. He did, Evelyn said. He used to go to bed right after dinner, after Mama died. Rose pressed the dough with her small hands. He said he was tired, but I think he just didn't want to sit in the room by himself. Evelyn worked the dough beside her. What do you think he wants now? Rose glanced up at her with those eyes. I think he wants what everyone wants, she said, to not be alone in it. Evelyn looked at this child, this 7-year-old who had come to her understanding of human nature through the specific education of watching her father grieve, and felt, not for the first time, the particular kind of love that arrives not through choice, but through accumulation. Through 60 days of mornings and meals and fence lines and courthouse benches and a dress and a wardrobe on an upper shelf. She had not expected to love Rose. She had expected to care for her, to be responsible for her, to show up for her the way she'd promised. Love was something she hadn't budgeted for, and it had arrived anyway, the way weather arrives. Not because you invited it, but because the conditions were right and there was nothing to stop it. The remaining debt to the bank was the problem that didn't resolve with the court ruling because courts don't pay creditors. $340 had become, with the Birch lease payment applied, $210 by December, which was real progress and was also still $210 that needed to exist by April, and Nathan tracked this number the way you track a thing you can't afford to forget. He did something in January that surprised her. He went to see his neighbor McPhail, the man who'd appeared at the courthouse without being asked and spoken briefly and credibly on his behalf, and came back with a grazing agreement for the spring that wasn't charity but was favorable, the kind of agreement that exists between men who have decided to trust each other. McPhail had more land than cattle, and Nathan had more cattle management experience than grazing room, and the arrangement made sense for both of them in a way that produced real numbers. When Nathan told her about it at the table that evening, he said, McPhail said he'd been meaning to propose something like this for 2 years. He just didn't know how to start the conversation. What changed? Evelyn asked. Nathan looked at her. He said he could see I was trying to do something real, that I wasn't just holding on by default anymore. A pause. He said my wife seemed like someone worth doing business with. She looked at him when he said my wife. They had not discussed the formal question of their arrangement since she'd arrived. The original terms, the letter exchange agreement, what it was, and what it might become. They had both been too occupied with the practical emergency of their situation to spend time on its definition. But he had said my wife to McPhail, and he was telling her that now, and they were both sitting at the table with the lamp between them, and neither of them was looking away. Is that what I am? She asked. Not with an edge. Just asking. He held her gaze for a moment. I'd like it to be, he said. It was the least romantic proposal she could have imagined, and she didn't mind that at all. It was honest, which was what he always was when he was being his best self. And honesty from Nathan Blackwood had come to mean more to her than eloquence from anyone else would have. All right, she said. He nodded. Then, I don't know how to do this well. I want you to know that going in. Neither do I, she said. We'll figure it out. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Almost a smile. You say that a lot. It keeps being true, she said. They married in February in the Ridgeline Courthouse, with Judge Voss presiding. The same judge, the same room, which struck Evelyn as fitting in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Tom and Margaret Cullen were there. Haskell came. McPhail and his wife. A handful of others from the territory who had decided, over the months since December, that Evelyn Hartwell was someone worth knowing. Rose stood beside Evelyn through the whole thing in her best dress, the one with the small blue flowers that Evelyn had helped her let out at the seams because she'd grown since summer, and held her hand during the vows with the particular grip of a child who is feeling something large and is managing it through physical contact. Afterward, outside, Rose said, So now what do I call you? Evelyn looked at her. What do you want to call me? Rose considered this with her usual seriousness. Not Mama, she said. That's already a word for someone. I know, Evelyn said, but Miss Hartwell is too. She made a face. It sounds like a school teacher. It does, rather. Can I just call you Evelyn? Yes, she said. You can call me Evelyn. Rose nodded, satisfied. Then she looked up at her father, who was talking to Tom Cullen nearby. Papa looks different today, she said. Evelyn looked at Nathan. He was standing with the ease she'd been watching develop over the past months. Not all the way there. Not some transformed man who'd left his grief behind like a coat at the door, but easier in his own skin than he'd been on that first day at the corral. Still guarded. Still inclined toward silence, but no longer sealed. He does, Evelyn agreed. He smiled, Rose said. At the part where you said yes. He smiled. Evelyn hadn't seen it from where she was standing. She had been looking at Judge Voss, saying the words, keeping her voice steady. She filed the information away in the place where she kept the things about Nathan that he wouldn't say directly, but that showed themselves in other ways. Good, she said. Spring came to Blackwood Ranch with the particular violence that Wyoming spring has. Not gentle, not the gradual warming of Ohio springs she'd known, but an abrupt shift from hard cold to something furious and wet. The snowmelt coming fast off the hills and turning every low spot to mud and every creek to something that needed watching. Nathan and Cal and Tomas spent 2 weeks fighting for the cattle through the worst of it, and Evelyn managed everything else. The house, the accounts, the supply runs, Rose's lessons, which had expanded now to include books Evelyn had ordered from a shop in Cheyenne because Rose had outgrown what the territory's limited resources offered. The McPhail grazing agreement generated its first payment in April. Combined with the spring cattle sales, better prices than Nathan had allowed himself to hope for, they closed the gap to the bank by mid-April. Nathan went to see Henderson on a Tuesday. He came back in the afternoon and came into the kitchen and said, without preamble, "It's done. The debt's cleared." Evelyn put down what she was holding. He stood in the doorway looking slightly stunned, the way men look when something they've been braced against for so long finally stops pressing, and the sudden absence of pressure is itself disorienting. "All of it?" she said. "All of it." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which she'd learned to do over the months of winter, and which he'd learned to accept. Still slightly unpracticed, still a beat behind in the way of a man whose body had forgotten it was allowed to be held, but genuine. He put his hands on her back and held on. "It's done," he said again, into the top of her head, like he was still learning the shape of the sentence. "It's done," she confirmed. They stood there in the kitchen in the April light, and she could feel the tension leaving him in the specific, gradual way that tension leaves a body that has been carrying something for a very long time. Not all at once. In increments, like a snowpack giving up its water, slowly, stubbornly, then all at once in the end. Rose came home from her lessons that afternoon, and Nathan told her plainly that the bank debt was finished. Rose listened, asked one clarifying question about what that meant for the ranch, and then said, "Good. That was the last big problem." Nathan and Evelyn looked at each other over her head. "There are always more problems," Nathan said carefully. "I know," Rose said, "but that was the last of the ones we were scared about." She said this with complete confidence, the way she said most things, and then went upstairs to change out of her school dress. Nathan looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn with an expression she had come to know well, the one that meant she is absolutely right, and I don't know how she does that. "The last of the ones we were scared about," Evelyn said. "Apparently," he said. She laughed. A real laugh. Not polite, not managed. And after a moment, Nathan made the sound that had been almost a laugh in the winter, and had since become an actual one, low and brief, but real, and the kitchen held the sound of it for a moment before it faded back into the ordinary sounds of the house. It was the small things that built a life. She had known this intellectually before she came to Wyoming, and had come to understand it in her body since. The way a house becomes familiar, not through any single significant moment, but through the daily accumulation of mornings in its kitchen, Evenings at its table, the specific creak of its third stair, the way light came through the east window in September. The way a person becomes known to you not through revelations but through the repeated evidence of their smallest choices. How they treated the ranch hands at the end of a hard day, whether they kept their word on the small things that nobody was checking, how they held a child's hand without appearing to notice they were doing it. Nathan had put curtains on the windows in March. She hadn't asked him to. She'd come home from town one afternoon to find him doing it, quietly, with the focused competence he brought to every physical task. And she had stood in the doorway, watching him finish the last window and not said anything until he was done. "They kept getting into my head," he said, not turning around, meaning the bare windows. "Every time I walked past them." "I know," she said. "Clara?" He stopped, started differently. It was time. She didn't push him to say more than that. She understood what it had cost him to stand on a chair and drive curtain hooks into a window frame, and she understood that explaining it would diminish something about the doing of it, and she let it be. A cloth appeared on the table the following week. She didn't know where he'd found it. She suspected Margaret Cullen. She put flowers on the table in May, the first ones that came up in the garden she'd planted along the east side of the house in early April. Not the garden's first season. She hadn't expected much from a first season. But a few things came through. The flowers were small and slightly crooked and genuinely not impressive, but they were there, and she put them in a jar on the table, and Nathan looked at them at dinner without saying anything. Rose said, "They're a bit lopsided." "They are," Evelyn agreed. "I like them," Rose said, in the tone of someone closing a subject. Nathan said nothing, but she caught him looking at the jar later that evening when he thought no one was watching. And the expression on his face was the one she'd learned to read most carefully. The one that didn't have a name but meant that something had gotten past the walls, quietly, without a fight. Helena came in June. She sent a letter first, which was different from before. Before, she had arrived on horseback with a lawyer, with the confidence of someone who expected to win. The letter was brief and careful. She asked if she might visit Rose. She said she understood if the answer was no. She did not mention the court case or the petition or anything that had happened in that courthouse. She just asked, plainly, if she could come and see her niece. Evelyn showed Nathan the letter. He read it twice. Then he handed it back. "That's your call," he said. "It's your house," she said. "It's Rose's aunt," he said. "And you're the one who told her what belonging here didn't have to mean." He looked at her. "So, your call." She wrote back and said Helena was welcome to come. Helena arrived on a Saturday morning in June, without the bay horse this time. She came in a buggy, driven by someone from town, which was somehow less imposing than riding. She brought a small package for Rose, and she stood at the gate looking at the house with an expression that Evelyn, watching from the porch, read as complicated. There was loss in it. There was also something that was trying to be something other than loss. Rose came out of the house and looked at her aunt across the yard. The two of them looked at each other for a moment. The woman who had promised to protect this child, and the child who had grown 3 months' worth since the last time they'd been in the same place. "Hello, Aunt Helena," Rose said. "Hello, Rose." Helena's voice was quieter than it had been all those months ago. The armor was still there, but it fit differently, like something that had been taken in after a loss of weight. Rose looked at the package Helena was holding. "Is that for me?" "It is." "Can I open it now?" "That's generally what presents are for," Helena said, and the dryness of it, the small, wry thing underneath the difficult exterior, made Rose's mouth twitch in a way that was, Evelyn thought, Clara showing through. They sat on the porch for 2 hours. Evelyn brought out coffee and stayed, not intrusively, but present, because Helena wasn't her enemy, and because Rose shouldn't have to manage the situation on her own, and because the porch of Blackwood Ranch was a place where Evelyn now had the right to sit. The conversation between Helena and Nathan was awkward and brief and necessary. There were things they said and things they didn't say, and the things they didn't say were the harder ones, about Clara, about the winter she died, about the guilt that both of them had been carrying in different ways for 2.5 years. They didn't resolve those things in 2 hours on a June porch. You don't resolve things like that in 2 hours. But they were in the same space, sitting in chairs that were close enough to suggest willingness, and that was where it started. Before she left, Helena stopped beside Evelyn at the garden. "You planted these?" she said, looking at the lopsided flowers. "First season," Evelyn said. "They're not much yet." Helena looked at them for a moment. "Clara planted things," she said. She was better at it." She paused. "She was better at most things than you'd think was fair." "I've heard that from several people," Evelyn said. Helena looked at her. Something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite an apology, because Helena was not the kind of woman who arrived at apology easily, but was the thing before it. The acknowledgement that some reckoning needed to happen, even if the exact form wasn't clear yet. I think she would have respected you," Helena said. Carefully, like she was still deciding if it was true while she said it. "I think she would have seen what you've done here and respected it." Evelyn looked at the garden. "That matters more than you might expect," she said honestly. Helena nodded once. Then she got back in the buggy and drove away down the track, and the dust settled behind her, and Evelyn stood at the garden a moment longer before going back to the porch, where Nathan and Rose were sitting in the evening light. The thing about choosing a life, Evelyn had come to understand, was that you didn't choose it once. You chose it every day, in the small decisions that nobody witnessed and the difficult moments that tested what you'd said you were going to do. You chose it when it was cold and you were tired and the arithmetic didn't add up. You chose it when someone looked at you and asked, implicitly or directly, whether you were really going to stay, and you answered not with words but by still being there the next morning. She had chosen Blackwood Ranch on a Tuesday in September when she bought a train ticket in Cincinnati with $42 in her bag and nobody to see her off. She had chosen it again on the wagon ride from Laramie when the sky opened up in every direction, and she thought, if this doesn't work, I have no way home. She had chosen it at the gate when a small girl ran across the yard and held on. She had chosen it in a barn in November, in the lamplight of the kitchen, on a courthouse bench in February, in a spare room with a folded dress in her hands. She kept choosing it. That was the only way she knew to mean it. The summer was the best the ranch had seen in 3 years, by Nathan's account. The cattle came through the spring strong. The McPhail arrangement continued and generated enough to maintain the buffer they needed between survival and genuine stability. Cal and Tomas stayed on, which was its own kind of vote of confidence. Men who had options didn't stay on a ranch that wasn't worth staying on. The south pasture healed enough from the wolf damage to run cattle again in the fall, and Nathan rebuilt the fence line with rails that went deeper than any wolf was likely to probe, and stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of a man who has fixed something properly. Rose turned 8 in July, and her birthday was the first one Evelyn had been there for, and she made a cake that was lopsided in the same way the garden flowers were lopsided, but tasted fine, and Rose declared it the best cake she'd ever had, which was either true or an act of generosity that amounted to the same thing. Nathan gave Rose a horse of her own, a young gray mare, small and well-tempered, that Rose named Clover because she'd been grazing in the clover patch when they went to choose her. Rose spent every evening that summer in the corral with Clover, learning her in the patient, methodical way she learned most things, and Nathan leaned on the corral fence watching her sometimes, and his face, in those moments, was the face of a man who is watching something. He was afraid he'd lose and hasn't lost, and can't quite believe it yet. Evelyn stood beside him one evening in late July, the summer light going long and gold across the yard, watching Rose and the gray mare moving in steady circles. "She's good with her," Evelyn said. "She is." Nathan watched Rose make a soft correction with the rein that the mare responded to immediately. "She's patient, that's the main thing." "She learned it from somewhere," Evelyn said. He glanced at her sideways. "Not from me. I'm not patient." "You're more patient than you think," she said. "You're just patient about things other than yourself." He looked at her with the look she'd come to love most, the one where he was caught off guard by something true and wasn't sure what to do with it. He didn't have a response for it. He just looked at her for a moment and then looked back at Rose, and the not responding was its own kind of answer. They stood there together in the July light, while Rose moved the gray mare through her paces, and the ranch was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a place that has absorbed a lot of weather and a lot of work, and has arrived, for this moment at least, at something that felt like rest. Evelyn thought about Cincinnati, about the spare room at her cousin's house, about the classroom that smelled of chalk and children, about the train platform and the empty air behind her when she left. She had been a woman watching her life from a distance, she had thought then. Present, but not landed. In motion, but not going anywhere particular. She was not watching from a distance anymore. She was in it, deep in it, up to her elbows, with the mud and the cold and the arithmetic and the wolves in the north pasture and the lopsided garden and the curtains Nathan had put on the windows in March, and the dress and the wardrobe that she sometimes thought about and had decided was not a ghost, but a fact, part of the history of this place, part of what it was built on, nothing to be afraid of. You couldn't love someone's life without loving the whole shape of it, the before as well as the now. The people who had been here before you, who had made it into something worth staying for. That wasn't competition, that was inheritance. She had inherited something when she came to Blackwood Ranch. A house with the shape of grief still in it, a man who'd forgotten how to rest, a child who watched the exits. She had not come with credentials or connections or the deep roots of someone born to the territory. She had come with $42 and a willingness to stay. And it had turned out that willingness, sustained past the point where it was easy, was the thing that mattered most. Not natural ability, not perfect love, not even hope, exactly. There had been days in November when she'd had very little of that. Just the decision, renewed each morning, to not be the person who left. That was the whole of it, really. The thing she would have told herself back on the train in Ohio if she'd known what was waiting in Wyoming. It's not going to be what you imagine. It's going to be harder and stranger and lonelier in ways you can't predict, and also fuller than anything you've had before. The only thing you'll need that you already have is the capacity to stay. Stay when it's cold. Stay when the arithmetic is bad. Stay when someone looks at you with a face that says you're temporary and I'm waiting for you to prove it. Stay until temporary becomes something else, and then stay past that until the thing you've built has the weight of permanence. That was how you built a home, not by arriving somewhere that already felt like one, by making something that didn't exist before you came. In September, 1 year after she'd bought the train ticket in Cincinnati, Evelyn was putting the garden to bed for the winter when Nathan came to stand beside her. He had something in his hand, a small box, plain wood, the kind of thing you'd find in a general store without looking for it. She straightened up and looked at him. He held the box out. She took it and opened it. Inside was a ring, not expensive, not flashy, the kind of thing a man bought in a frontier town with what he had, rather than what he wished he had. A narrow silver band with a small dark stone that she couldn't identify in the fading September light. "We did the courthouse thing in February," he said, "but I didn't—" He stopped. "I wanted to do this properly. I was waiting until it felt like the right time." She looked at the ring. What made this the right time? He looked at the yard, at the house with its curtains, at the garden she was putting to bed, at the corral where Clover stood in the early evening quiet. "A year," he said. "You've been here a year." He looked at her. "You stayed." "I told you I would," she said. "I know." A pause. "I didn't entirely believe it then. Do you believe it now?" He looked at her with the directness that was his most essential quality, the thing that had been there from the beginning, underneath the walls and the silence and the grief. "Yes," he said. She took the ring out of the box and put it on. It fit, which was either luck or Nathan had been more attentive to the details of her hands than she'd known. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then he did something he didn't do often and had to work to do. He reached out and took her hand, the one with the ring on it, and held it. Not for long. A moment. But with the full intention of it. Rose came out of the house at that moment and looked at them standing together in the garden in the fading September light. She looked at their joined hands, she looked at the ring, she looked at her father's face, and then at Evelyn's. "Oh, good," she said. "I was wondering when you'd get around to that." Nathan made a sound. Evelyn laughed outright, the real unmanaged laugh that this family had learned to bring out of her without trying. Rose looked satisfied in the way she looked when things arranged themselves the way she believed they should, And then she went back inside to see about dinner because she was practical and unsentimental and also 8 years old and there was food to think about. Nathan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Nathan. The September light came across the Wyoming Valley the way it had every evening for as long as there had been light and valley, indifferent to what happened below it, carrying on regardless. The ranch sat in it, the barn, the house, the corral, the lopsided garden, the fence lines that went deeper than any wolf could probe. The Blackwood Ranch that Evelyn had driven up to a year ago had been a place held together by stubbornness and grief, and a man who hadn't figured out yet that surviving and living weren't the same thing. It was still held together by stubbornness. Some things don't change completely and shouldn't, but something else was in it now. Not in any corner or room she could point to, just in it, the way warmth is in a house that's been properly heated, not located in any one place but present everywhere you go. She had come across the country looking for a life worth living. She had found instead the harder and more worthwhile thing, a life worth building. Day by day, decision by decision, frost and mud, and bad arithmetic, and small flowers in a jar and curtains on the windows, and a child who called her Evelyn, and a man who held her hand in the September garden and meant it. Not perfect, not easy, not anything she could have imagined on the train platform in Cincinnati with nobody there to see her go. Just real. Thoroughly, imperfectly, enduringly real. That was enough. That was, she had learned the whole thing.
Teaching me how to have a firm handshake. Of course, he was the entrepreneur with various businesses and stuff, and so that was the part that impressed me. I don't know, he impressed me with anything in life. He was good at fucking everything, man. I think we're going to skip this part because I don't need. Goes through like, oh wow, and it surprised me. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. No, I love it when people surprise me like that. I fucking love that shit. But I think there's something about first time meeting someone and they had all right, sounds good, Gibby. Thanks for hanging out with us. Have a good night. Sleep well. Thanks for hanging out. Appreciate you for stopping by. Have you have a great week.